saying this will be a casual session. Let's go around the room really quick and introduce everyone. Saga City, would you like to start?
Yes, Sagacity Walker from Everyday Democracy. I'm the Community Assistance Associate. I provide support and resources for our coaches out working in communities and as well as working with communities directly.
My name is Milana Rogers-Bryson, and I'm the Program Associate here at Everyday Democracy, working on kind of mapping the work we're doing in communities all across the country and pulling out the lessons from different places we've worked, and also working on youth engagement, so trying to help communities think about how to engage youth and give them a voice in decision-making in the process.
And I'm Richard Frieder. I'm Senior Associate with Everyday Democracy. Senior because of all the gray hair, which they don't have. A couple. I have to look pretty closely there. I also do work independently, community engagement, consulting work under the name Community Capacity Builders. A lot of that work is in Hartford, but some of it is elsewhere in Connecticut and a little bit beyond the borders of Connecticut. And since we're here to talk about libraries and community engagement, I should say that I worked as the community engagement director at Hartford Public Library for 15 years until about a year ago.
Cool. So I'm going to give the audience here an opportunity to also introduce themselves. Alexandria, let's start with you.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm here from the New York Public Library, and we are organizing, 20 different branches are organizing community conversations programs beginning in the fall. Richard, I know that you're going to be helping out with our one-day training on July 20th, and we're all really looking forward to that. We see this as a great opportunity to build community engagement and community organizing skills that our branch staff could really use in introducing new programs. So. Thanks.
Great. Cindy?
Yeah. Hey, it's Cindy Fessmeyer. I'm in Columbus, Wisconsin. I'm the director here. Richard and I have worked together in the past on libraries transforming communities. And like Susan mentioned, I too am teaching community engagement in an academic setting. In just about a week and a half, I will kick off a one-credit boot camp teaching aspiring librarians how to find engaged partnerships when they enter into their profession.
Awesome, thank you. So let's do Courtney next.
Hey there, it's Courtney Brees from the National Coalition for Dialogue with Liberation. Listening in to see the conversation and if I can offer anything, but I admittedly am sitting in an airport right now, so I apologize. I'm going to mute myself most of the time.
That's okay. Susan, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Oh, sure. Susan Hildreth again, and I probably introduced myself too long at the beginning, but I'm the professor of practice at the University of Washington Information School. And that's a position that was funded by the Gates Foundation for 10 years. So I'm just the first of 4 or 5. And I'm very interested in community engagement, have been so for a number of years, and particularly as the former director of Institute of Museum and Library Services under the Obama administration. And also, I'm going to call out Cindy, because Cindy also is a great supporter and a promoter of the Aspen Institute on Dialogue for the Future of Our Public Libraries, and I'm also involved in that activity, which certainly aligns well with community engagement in libraries.
Great, thanks, Susan. And then Christy, would you like to introduce yourself? Okay, Christy might be having issues with her microphone. If you would like, you can type in the chat box and introduce yourself. In the meantime, Mary, would you like to introduce yourself really quick? You just muted yourself.
Now, can you hear me?
There we go.
Okay. Can you see me?
I got a camera
I can
working.
see it now.
Yeah? Isn't it great? Okay, so this is Mary Davis Fournier. I'm the project director for the Libraries Transforming Communities initiative at ALA, and I've been privileged to be have access to all of your brains for this entire journey that ALA is taking. So I'm really excited that we have a chance for this informal discussion today, and I'm also here to warn you that we will use your thoughts, and we are excited that you're engaged in this. And all of this type of dialogue within our profession is helping us to sort of learn what works and what needs work, and how ALA can best support this work. Great, thanks, Mary. Christy just introduced herself. She is the Director of Communications and Partnerships for Howard County Library System in Maryland, and she runs the Choose Civility Initiative for Howard County, Maryland. Great. Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm going to actually turn it over to Everyday Democracy really quick to give a brief update, or not update, overview of their Dialogue to Change process, just as a refresher, and then we'll dive into questions.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. Appreciate you all coming back so we can answer some more questions and whatnot. I always like answering questions. I'm sure Milana and Richard are on the same page. Feels the energy and the enthusiasm. So quick recap of the Dialogue to Change process. When I try to give people like the quick elevator speech, I usually do it this way. I say we do organizing, and then we hold dialogues, and then we actually work on action plans. So that's pretty much how the dialogue process works. Is you organize a group of people together, discuss what the issue is you want to address, and then you train facilitators. Those facilitators facilitate dialogues, which will address and come up with ideas to address whatever issue you're facing. And then lastly, with those ideas, you come up with action plans and you implement those action plans. And that is the Dialogue to Change process very quickly. I tried to do that in, what was that? We just went up 10 floors.
Thank you. So I'll get us started with questions. So one of the ones that came out of the webinar was, as facilitators or organizers, how do you motivate attendees to remain engaged throughout the whole 4 to 6 week process?
I can say something. So I think that part of that is around recruitment. And so, being able to communicate why this is important and kind of be able to sell it in a way. So picking the right issue that really motivates people to be engaged and is something that they really care about. And also communicating, I think last time I was saying you could say, this is 8 hours of your time, or this is 10 hours of your time that you're donating. So kind of how do you frame that ask so that people will make that commitment? And then the other thing is that I've seen in most communities, people do want to stay throughout the process. And I think a lot of that is just the way the conversation builds. And so, having that relationship building and knowing that, you're building towards action and that you're actually going to be doing something with this conversation. I think people often are surprised at how many people do want to stay throughout the process just because it is engaging to them and because they feel like they have a voice and they can make a difference.
Piggybacking off of what Milana said, they're going to say ditto, especially, I like how she brought that up because I wasn't even thinking of how you pitch it to people is very important during the recruitment, is saying, letting people know from the very beginning how much time we're going to be spending on this. It's a donation of at least 10 hours, right? There's that. And then making sure that the issue is important to people to talk about. And lastly, also similar to what Milana was saying is that once people actually experience what the dialogue, how the dialogue works after the first session, it's a very different experience. It's unlike, people go to community meetings all the time, and this is not a regular community meeting format. So this is something different where you get to talk to people about whatever the issue is, and you also get to know one another. And there's also activities and things like that. So I think that's the thing that keeps people coming back, because it isn't just 10 people sitting around in a circle, talking about how we're going to solve the issue. in a traditional manner. So I think that's one of the things that keeps people engaged.
Yeah, and I would also just say that I think people often, what we hear is that people want to talk more. You know, after the 2 hours are up, they're like, oh, we really wanted to stay. We didn't get to say what we really wanted to say or everything we wanted to say. So it's interesting how much people do want to talk about these things.
And I would add just a couple of things. One is that there are some things you can do to make it easier for people. One is to provide childcare. Another is to provide transportation. Another, depending on who the participants are, can be translation. Obviously, food. So all of those little things, in addition to what Sagacity and Milana have said, those can help. And the other thing I would add is that, and we really did not get into this very much in the webinar, you don't, it's not carved in stone that you have to do this as a 4 to 6 week kind of thing. You can modify this process. I've done that many times, and lots of people have. So that's another thing to keep in mind. There are trade-offs. If you're going to modify the process, there are trade-offs. You may gain some things, but you may lose some things, but it certainly can be done.
Great. Does anyone in the audience have a question?
Well, this is Susan, and I have a question. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you focus the recruitment, and what do you do if you have some folks in your community that are kind of like gadflies, either on a topic you're discussing, or maybe gadflies around the institution, the library? I mean, is there anything you can do about that? I mean, how does the recruitment work?
It was a little hard to hear everything.
Yeah, I heard most of what you said, but it started breaking up with, you said, what do you do if people, it sounded like gaslight? Or?
I'm sorry. I said gadflies or complainers.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so what do we do about people who complain a lot? And then the first part was recruitment, focusing recruitment, and then the gaslight. Okay. All right, so anybody want to take that? With recruitment, I think that's pretty much being mindful of the relationships that you already have that are strong, and then thinking of those relationships that you don't have that are not strong, and how do you cultivate that relationship, right? Because it's one thing to say, all right, well, first, this is also part of the organizing training too that we do, is mapping who are those people that you do want at the table depending on what the issue is. So if you're going to be discussing education, you're going to want someone from the school, board of ed, things like that, right? And if you do have relationships with them, maybe, you know, your kids go to school together, or I don't know, you see each other at the basketball court or something like that, then okay, that's one way that you already have a relationship with that person, so you can invite them that way. But if you don't, then this is where the process may take a little bit longer, because now you have to actually begin to build that relationship with that person. Like, what's your in? Are you going to meet them at a certain meeting? Are you going to go, you know, to the office, set up a more formal meeting, things like that. Being where people are, because that's for, you know, just official people. But then there's also, you know, regular community members, you know, whether it be, you know, neighbors, things like that. Like, it's meeting people in certain spaces where it's a community space, and being mindful of how you actually build a relationship with someone. It's one of those things where you can't give a prescription for it, because with some people you have to go to church. With other people, it'll be, you know, country club or something like that. But it's about being in those spaces where people congregate. And then when they see you there and get to know you in those spaces, that's when it's easier to invite them to go places. And when it comes to, what did you call them? Gadflies, I think it was. When it comes to people like that, I think that's where it's important to have a really good facilitator, because the discussion guide kind of is something to kind of discourage that behavior, because if the discussion is actually led in a particular manner, then we're staying on topic, talking about this issue in this manner, and we're getting everybody in there. That, and when we do ground rules before any session, and we review those ground rules, those type of things kind of weed those type of people out.
I see a question in the chat. Does Everyday Democracy teach those effective facilitation techniques? So yes, like Sagasti said, we have the organizing training, but we also have a facilitation training that we provide, and our goal is to have community facilitators facilitating all of these dialogues. And so it's people that the people in the dialogue can relate to. And so we do that training for communities and try to kind of help the community build that capacity to facilitate their own conversations. That training is also a day long. All of our trainings are about a day long. And we go through some of the specific techniques that you would need for facilitation, as well as really helping the participants kind of get associated with the discussion guide and with the issue. So, you know, what does the discussion guide look, what is the agenda for the dialogue, and kind of becoming more familiar with that and actually getting to practice with other people.
And I would add, just on the recruitment issue, this is one of the reasons that this kind of work usually you do with partners. Is because your partners will bring their own networks to the dialogue. And it's probably, although there may be some overlap, it probably parts of their network are, you don't have it in your own network. So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 partners, you broaden the whole network.
So, you know, the old adage of, you know, invite 10 people to invite 10 people, I think.
Great. Does anyone else have a question? Because I've got another one.
I have a question. This is Alex. So can you talk a little bit more about the kickoff event? One of the ways that we are thinking about structuring kind of the public rollout of these conversations is testing the waters in our communities through introducing a kickoff event, just to kind of see what type of response we get. Is that an appropriate use of the kickoff model? What types of ideas do you have for that?
That sounds to me a little bit more like an initial informational event. That usually by the time you get to the kickoff event, you've decided that what you're going to do, and okay, you've got a plan, and you're using the kickoff event to kick it off. What you described sounds to me more like, you may remember, if you were part of the webinar, I went into quite a bit of detail about a community dialogue we did at Hartford Public Library. And one of the first things we did was have an informational meeting where we brought people in, invited people in, did a sample dialogue, provided information about the dialogue, how it works, did some brainstorming. So that's the way it strikes me.
Yeah, I pretty much say what Richie said. If you want to test the waters to see, you know, how many people you can get to come out and stuff like that, I would say holding certain, maybe different types of events, but if you could build in a sample dialogue in there, so then that way they know what it is that you want to, where you want to go, then I think that would be the best way, is sample dialogue. Because that's usually what gets people on board saying, yes, I like this process.
Yeah, so is the sample dialogue could it be part of the informational meeting? Is that sometimes what
Yes, definitely.
Great, because I think that,
go ahead.
There's a little bit of nervousness around, like, if we plan this massive series of conversations, we don't want to suffer from the defeat of, like, no attendance. And right. So we want to build in the evaluation kind of period that might come after the informational meeting, I guess, in this case. So the reasoning behind my question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And it's sort of a built-in process. If you start out with one or more of these, what I'm referring to as informational meetings, you can call it whatever you want, that sort of starts the build-in process, so that you really build momentum. So by the time you get to the kickoff event, you're almost assured of having a good turnout.
Great.
Great. Anyone else before I ask a question? So do you have any suggestions for how librarians might be able to respond to criticism that this is getting too political into these conversations? How to, because the library is supposed to be politically neutral. So what kind of argument would you make for that?
Well, if it's done right, and I put right in quotes, it's really, these dialogues are about giving people a voice and giving a great diversity of people a voice. And I suppose somebody could consider that political, but I don't know. I don't consider that political. We're not, whether it's a library or some other organization, we are not telling people what they should be thinking or what kinds of action they should be taking. That's totally, it's driven by the participants. The may be decided in advance, or as we talked about on the webinar, the topic can be chosen by participants in some early sort of community conversations. But so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if it's done the way it's designed, it's really not political. And the only way I can imagine somebody charging that it is political is if they're really not interested in giving a voice to everybody. I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Richard in that I wouldn't consider it political because at no point is the library or the facilitator saying this is how we should proceed. This is how you should think. This is how you should decide on this particular issue. It's just really providing community members a space to discuss these issues and what they would like to do. So yeah, I'm not necessarily sure if that would be, count as being political.
And hey, this is Cindy in Columbus.
Yeah.
I'll say, so I get this question sometimes too when I'm doing stuff, and I think the process that we're all doing is infinitely democratic, but that's with a lowercase d, and I think that's a really important distinction. You guys, particularly with this process, will have that confusion from people, but just talking about it as a dialogue as you do and giving people equal access, very democratic. And I don't know if that helps assuage people's fears about this becoming political with a capital P. But our mission to provide equal access to tools, whatever they be, is inherently democratic, and there's no way around that.
Great, yeah.
Is anybody, I'm curious, is anybody aware of an instance where a library or any organization has been accused of playing politics by doing a community dialogue of this kind?
This is Susan, and I would say that I don't know that it has happened. It may have happened, but I think what's more likely to happen is that some library staff will kind of hide behind this neutrality theory if they don't want to go into this new area, which requires, deep community engagement, facilitation skills, and kind of activities that they may not be accustomed to or trained for. So I've seen that used as an excuse not to do this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, well, I'm not sure I've seen that, but I know it happens. I can imagine it happening. And there again, I think a little bit of education could address those issues. Like Sagacity said earlier, a sample dialogue, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so a sample dialogue is worth 1,000 words. You can do it in an hour or approximately. And it answers so many questions. And most people, in my experience, most people tend to get excited and engaged by it.
And you could even do the sample dialogue with other library staff, to kind of give them a picture of what this process is and get buy-in from other staff.
Great, yeah. So What tips can you share to help transition community leaders used to operating in top-down approach to something more proactive and inclusive?
So, I mean, I think that this also goes back to the sample dialogue and kind of giving and thinking about, the people, the stakeholders, the people who are in these different positions in the community, that they also go through the process before and kind of get a picture of what that looks like. Yeah, and do you have other thoughts?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, that sample dialogue. I think in the pre-planning stages, like whether it be the info session, how Richard was mentioning, just being sure that everybody knows how the process works, and actually having them be involved in that process, and actually participate in what we call like a sample dialogue, right? Because as long as you're there and you see how it works and feel how it works, that's what's going to make you say, okay, yes, I think this is something I can buy into, versus just being told about it and it's like, well, I still want to centralize my power. I think that's the main difference, is when people actually get to see that, see and feel how it works. That's the main thing, I think, is what really is what makes it.
And I think kind of letting people know that there are different roles they can play in this process. They can play, there's the facilitators, there's the organizing team, there's also a coalition. So there's a way that they could sponsor the event or kind of, support the event in different ways without necessarily being a part of making it happen in all the steps.
I guess the only other thing I'd add is, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I got it.
Yeah, so what tips can you share to help transition community leaders used to operating in top-down approach to something more proactive and inclusive?
I think everything that Sagacity and Milana said was great. The other thing that comes to mind is to sell it to them as something that's going to help them do their job. Because the question specified community leaders. That's the part I wasn't sure about. So if they are community leaders, that on some level, in some way, what they're interested in is bettering the community. And I think these dialogues can be sold to such folks as a way to help them do their job better, to give them a better understanding of the community, to give them insights that it's an opportunity to gain insight. Everybody, we all have the question in our mind all the time, what's in it for me? So it's always good to try to answer that question. And that might be a way to deal with these community leaders who could be reluctant.
And that's something we also do in the organizing training, is kind of brainstorming, who are the people who are missing from this conversation, who are really getting that representation from the community. So making sure that as many people as possible who are involved in the conversation and thinking about those groups that are missing, and then saying, okay, this group business, people who own businesses, they're not represented right now in our coalition. So what do we need to say? How do we sell it to them? What is it? What's in it for them? And what's our message to them?
Great. Could you guys talk a little bit more about how you determine who is missing from the table, or who is missing in a conversation?
I think a lot of that, because we're not in the community and we don't know every community, it's kind of working with the coalition, making sure that the community already has a coalition in place, right? So they already have those diverse leaders at the table from the beginning. They have those partners, and we kind of require that in our process, that when we do work with the community, that they already do have those partnerships built on some level, and you can continue to deepen those partnerships, but that they're already starting from that point, and not just working in isolation. And then and then we're kind of working through a process of really just brainstorming with the community, and if they have the right people in the room, then they'll know who's missing. I mean, if you have two people in the room, then they're not going to know that. But us from the outside and not being a part of the community, we don't necessarily know who those groups are. But kind of doing that brainstorming process with the community leaders in the room.
Yeah, and I would say just talk about it often. That informational meeting that we talked about earlier, that's something that could be on the agenda for the informational meeting, for the kickoff event, especially in the early stages, to often put that question on the table: who is missing, and how do we connect with them?
Yes, that, and we do have activities for doing that. Like whether it be mapping or things of that nature. So there's different ways to actually tease that information out and say who are the people that we really want. Whether it be looking at what's the demographics of your community as a whole, then like how do we get representation from each of these different segments? You know what I mean? Things like that. If it's about a particular issue, or what, who's involved in this public service or whatever have you. Things like that, and how do we get people on board from that office? Things like that will actually help with recruiting different types of people that are.
Great. A related question in the chat is, so you're saying that you should already have partnerships in place when you start this?
Yeah. Yes, that's very important. And that's something, in our initial kind of process with the community, when they call us, we ask them about that and try to make sure that, not all of your partnerships are in place, but that you at least have a number of partnerships already. You have a number of other groups that are supporting this work, and not just kind of one agency or one person who's doing this.
But it's a great way to start a partnership if you don't happen to have the partnerships already. I think the point is that you don't want to do this kind of community dialogue without the partnerships, whether they're partnerships that you've had for a decade or partnerships that you're just created for this dialogue. And a lot of organizations of various kinds will find it attractive if you approach them and say, hey, we want to do community dialogue and this is what it's about, blah, blah. And a lot of them will naturally say, hey, we'd love to be part of it.
Yeah. So with that being said, too, I mean, since I've been here, I've seen, pretty much a full spectrum of communities and organizations that didn't have any partnerships in place, and then it took them, months to build that, to working with communities and organizations that did have some partnerships in place and they were ready to go. And then others where it was like, we have some, but we need to build some more. So that type of thing, it's like what Richard just said, what you don't want is just to be on one organization's or one person's shoulders. So that's the importance of having partnerships. But at the same time, if you don't have any now, don't think of that as a discouragement as now you can't do it. It's just one of those things of being intentional about how do you build those partnerships so you can have a successful dialogue. And in terms of building those partnerships, having a process and saying, this is an initiative or a project we really want to work on. Would you like to partner on this with us? That's the type of thing that can get the partnership going.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left. Does anyone else have questions for? Okay. Well, to wrap us up then, I think I'm going to ask this final question, and that is, what are some of the opportunities and challenges you see people facing when trying to do this in their community?
That's a very loaded question. I don't even want to take it personally.
I think one of the challenges is maybe just continuing to evaluate, who's not in the room, like Richard said, I've seen communities where, they start really strong with kind of questioning that and continuing to bring new people in, but then at some point you kind of get burnt out and start working with the same group. And so continuing to kind of have that evaluation built into your process so that it kind of continues throughout and you continue to kind of ask that question. So sustainability, I think, is a challenge and kind of making sure that it doesn't just end, when you go to the action forum. The action teams are like continuing to work together. They're continuing to, grow, and kind of like, and part of that is maybe having those kind of small wins. So like being able to say, okay, we succeeded in achieving this action. And so they want to continue working together and moving forward. And then also, having the support of an institution or some institutions that can kind of provide either financial support or just resources or staffing is also helpful in kind of continuing that sustainability.
I guess, there's a lot that could be said in answer to this question, but one thing that comes to mind is to try it, because I think it's easy to get intimidated. And the three of us, we did this webinar, we're talking today, and this sounds like a big deal, a lot of work, a big project, and it certainly can be, and it is. But you can take steps. You don't have to do it all in one fell swoop. You can try, so you can stick your toe in the water a couple of times and start to get a feel for it and build. So I guess that's one of the challenges, is to not be intimidated, because anybody can do this, and the process can be adapted to fit your circumstances. So
I guess the opportunities too, I think, is that even if it does end, I think, at that action, that I think there is benefit throughout, so even if you just go through the dialogue, that I think people do benefit in those kind of individual ways, and we've seen lots of different kinds of changes come out of it. So I think, like Richard said, it's like trying it in itself, I think, is an opportunity.
Alexandra, or Alex, had a question. She's wondering if you have any ideas on how to modify the process if you just want to stick your toe in the water.
Well, toe, foot. If you want to stick your toe in the water, you can have, again, what I've been calling an informational meeting. You can learn a lot from that. Without necessarily making a big commitment. You can put it in the context of an exploratory meeting. So that's an example of putting your toe in the water. Putting your foot in the water, an example could be to do the dialogue to change process, but do it in a day rather than over 4 to 6 weeks. And that's plenty of people have done that. So you take a day, or at least half a day, maybe a full day, and go through the same process, but consolidate everything into the one day. Well, I said earlier, there are trade-offs. You gain things and you lose things by adapting the process. So what you lose by doing that, or lose some of it anyway, is the relationship building. A lot of the relationship building that results from the dialogue to change process happens because people are getting together, once a week for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, and that tends to be more of a relationship building experience rather than the day-long approach. But that would be putting your foot or leg in the water rather than doing the whole thing. But really, putting a toe in the water would be just to have a kind of an exploratory informational meeting. Another approach that can be used is this was on the list of questions, but it didn't come up today. Rather than determining the topic in advance, you can have a series, and that could mean, 3 or 4 or 8 or 20 of informal community conversations, small group community conversations, to talk with people just about the community, what's happening in the community, what are your concerns, what are your priorities for action, that sort of thing. And you can take the input from those community conversations and turn it into a dialogue using this dialogue to change process. So again, that's a different way to approach it. It's more incremental. But those are some thoughts on taking some steps rather than the whole big thing.
Another thing you could do is a pilot dialogue. So it's something like a sample, but it's with, it could be longer. So you could have a group of say 10 leaders that you connect with, have a dialogue on a specific topic, and they could go through the whole process or even an abbreviated version. But I was actually just in New Mexico this weekend, and they did a pilot dialogue on community police relations, and they want to have whatever came out of that, they actually do want to feed it to legislators, so give them to give them ideas of what the community is thinking, what they're talking about. And so if you get the right people in the room, you can still have some small impact on the community just from having that pilot, and kind of get a sense of where people are at. And it also can help, those people could become kind of part of an organizing team if you want to move forward and if they're interested.
Great. So before we wrap up, does anyone have any final questions or comments? You're very weak. You're very quiet, Mary. We can't hear you quite. No.
Maybe write it in the chat. Oh.
What is that? Good question.
Oh, something about the picture.
That's something Sagacity just whipped off
Yeah,
5 minutes before this.
Before we sat down.
So this is from, we had our national convening in December, where a number of community leaders and people who are doing this work in different parts of the country came together. And so we had a graphic illustrator.
Yeah.
So they were kind of capturing everything that was happening, like all the panelists, what they were saying, all the conversations that they heard. They were capturing it visually. So this is some of what came out of it. It's like a peace sign in the middle. It's the time is now. So that was the theme of the conference was, what was it? The moment is now. And then justice isn't peace. What does peace mean to you? On community police relations. Yeah. As beloved community, and yeah, a lot of different ideas.
Glad you like it.
Okay, great. Now that the mystery is solved, and that is a really cool graphic art. Thank you so much for Saga City, Milana, and Richard for doing this and answering the Q&A, and for everyone who has joined us today.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.